Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you. It's a great pleasure to be here. The mic is on, and I'm being filmed. Great. That's why I wore black, because it's slimming. Because the camera. I hope it's good. Thank you. It's such a great pleasure to be here. It was such an honor to give my lecture last year, thanks to Sandy Stelz in the library. And it's such an honor to come back now under the auspices of comparative literature and also this evening for the library. And I want to share with you some work that has been going on in various ways in my teaching, in my scholarship, on the idea of lyric poetry and the ways in which the study of lyric poetry can serve as a kind of touchstone for a variety of literary, historical, critical, and theoretical problems. One of the things that I'll be talking about will be the two poems attributed to Thomas Wyatt that are on the double-sided handout that you have from the so-called Devonshire manuscript. And Bob graciously alluded to an article I published last year in the Chaucer Review about the question of how poetic extracts function in late medieval manuscripts, and how scribes and readers may be taking selections from longer narrative poems and turning them into newly calibrated freestanding lyrics. And this relationship between the lyric and the narrative is something that I think is immensely important for the late medieval and the early modern. That is, the way in which the categories and genres of narrative and lyric or epic and romance are intensely fluid, and the ways in which we can see the job of the reader, the job of the anthologist, the scribe, and the compiler to, if you like, either excavate or to create lyric voices out of narrative frames. One of the central problems that I also want to raise in a preliminary way is the place of the lyric in our literary history. Several years ago, I was involved with the Cambridge History of Medieval Literature, edited by David Wallace, a huge and compelling and comprehensive volume, except that there are no two consecutive pages on medieval lyric. There will be nothing on the Harley lyrics. There will be nothing on Middle English expressions of devotion or desire. The lyric, I've suggested elsewhere, and I still believe, was written out of the historicist narrative of literary history, in large part because lyric poetry had long been considered the purview of old-style formalist new criticism. That lyric poetry was, in some sense, unhistoricizable, precisely because it seemed so universal. Someone like Helen Vendler, for example, could still write in one of her most recent books, her study of Shakespeare's sonnets, that by definition, she said, the lyric resists, this is her language, social and historical reading, because a lyric can be voiceable by anyone. So it's this association of the genre of lyric poetry with formalist reading that I think has gotten it written out of a fair amount of recent literary history. And so the question is, how do we put it back? What is historical about the lyric? What is historicist about studying the lyric? So I want to make a few suggestions today. One is to see how the manuscript and early circulation environment of lyric poetry constitutes its historical basis. But second of all, I want to draw on some recent work that's been associated with the unfortunately named New Formalism to argue that formalism and the study of form is historical. Since we're a group of medievalists and early modernists, I think, I want to call attention to a recent book by Eleanor Johnson of Columbia University, a remarkable book about the Boethian tradition in Chaucer, Hoccleve, Usk, and Gower. And she is intensely philological, intensely paleographical and codicological, intensely historical. But what she says in this book, it's called Practicing Literary Theory in the Middle Ages, And if I'm sniffing, it's because I'm not used to the East Coast cold. It's not because of anything political. Tell me he's not on coke. Okay. Ellie Johnson says, formalism is not belletrism. It is not a denial of the presence of history in the world. Quite the contrary, it's a tool for handling history. All things material, because form is the material of culture. Form, she says, is the truly historical element in literature. And I think that this book came out in 2012, and I think that part of what she's working with and responding to is a new turn towards the study of the lyric, really just in the last 5 to 10 years. Not just Johnson's book, but the collection edited by Yopi Prince and Virginia Jackson, theory of the lyric theory reader. Jonathan Culler's very provocative recent book that just came out last year, Theory of the Lyric, and a brilliantly cranky review essay published in Modern Philology last year by Stephen Burt on the new turn in lyric. So part of what I want to do today is a short, if you like, exemplary attempt to engage with some texts that may be representative of some newer ways of trying to understand the relationship of form and history, genre and authorship, manuscript and reading, and also to some extent pedagogy as well in the lyric. And so the texts that I've chosen are two poems by Thomas Wyatt, one of which you may recognize and one of which you may not. In looking at these, I want to look back to, in particular, some of the heritage of Chaucer's verse making, and I want to argue or sustain an argument that I've been making of Wyatt as a Chaucerian, and by implication, therefore, Wyatt as a Boethian, Wyatt as someone who is responding very closely to the 15th century tradition of John Lydgate, Stephen Hawes, John Skelton, Charles d'Orléans, their practices of understanding Chaucerian reception. And I want to begin with the poem number 1, a poem attributed to Thomas Wyatt. It's preserved, but without any attribution, in the famous Devonshire manuscript of the 1530s. It begins, "Absence absenting causeth me to complain." I'll read it in just a minute, but I want to just start off by saying that this is a poem that I think has largely been ignored. Have any of you seen this poem before, worked with this poem, taught this poem? Good. So it's brand new. Unlike the sonnets, unlike the other lyrics, unlike the songs that have defined what people have called Wyatt's unquiet sensibility, this poem lacks what we expect of him. Rather than strutting forth in careful iambs, it seems to limp along in uneven stresses. Rather than looking forward to the Italianate sprezzatura of Sidney or Spenser, it really looks back to the aureate diction of Stephen Hawes and John Lydgate. And rather than developing an argument through sinuous rhetoric, it seems to move only through repetition. The poet's isolation here builds through iteration, echoing in the final phrasing of each quatrain, which repeats the opening words, which anticipates the opening words of the next. And even though this text in the manuscript is no more or less secure than any other one, it has been highly amended by scholars and editors. And Ron Rebholz, the editor of the Penguin Complete Works, virtually amends out of existence the poem's last two lines. So I'm going to read it. "Absence absenting causeth me to complain, my sorrowful complaints abiding in distress, and departing most privy, increaseth my pain. Thus live I uncomforted, wrapped in all heaviness. In heaviness I am wrapped, devoid of all solace, neither pastime nor pleasure can revive my dull wit. My spirits be all taken, and death doth me menace, with his fatal knife the thread for to cut. For to cut the thread of this wretched life, and shortly bring me out of this case, I see it availeth, not yet must I be pensive, since fortune from me hath turned her face, hath turned with countenance contrarious, and clean from her presence she hath exiled me, in sorrow remaining, as a man most dolorous, exempt from all pleasure and worldly felicity. All worldly felicity now I am privat, and left in desert most solitary, wandering all about as one without a mate. My death approacheth, what remedy? What remedy, alas, to rejoice my woeful heart, with sighs suspiring most ruefully? Now welcome, I am ready to depart. Farewell all pleasure, welcome pain and smart. Absence here is a personification. It's a kind of embodied condition, on a par with the personifications of other medieval complaints. Old age, sorrow, fortune, all stand in 14th and 15th century poetry as instigators of the poet's complaining. Here, in a bit of repetitive verbal trickery, the poet affirms what absence does. Absence creates a state of absence, absence absenting. The poem also affirms what fortune does, turns her face away, and generates a heaviness and a lack of comfort. The poet's dull wit, that phrase, the touchstone of post-Chaucerian self-denial, his dull wit cannot be revived by, quote, pastime nor pleasure, a verbal collocation that I believe evokes Stephen Hawes' most famous poem, printed in 1509 by Wynkin de Worde, The Pastime of Pleasure. Fortune has turned her face with countenance contrarious, an alliterative pairing worthy, I think, of John Skelton, whose character Counterfeit Countenance in the 1515 play Magnificence embodies all that is duplicitous about the courtly life. But such duplicity harkens back to Boethius's Consolation of Philosophy, that great defining philosophical and literary text for the Chaucerian tradition, where the prisoner laments that fortune's clouded, cheating face had changed. The poet's exile from felicity also recalls the terms of the prisoner's opening at the Consolation of Philosophy, while the request for a remedy recalls the way in which Boethius talks about his need for a soul's physician. The narrator is now in a, quote, dolorous state. And one of the great things about digital technology is that you can type in the word dolorous and see that it appears, and I got 134 occasions in which dolor, dolorous, dolorousness, and dolor appear in Skelton, Lydgate, and Hawes. It is the touchstone of the post-Chaucerian tradition. There is pervasive aureation, repetition, almost a Skeltonic sense here of an alliterative veneer. So what's going on in this poem? Absence had emerged as one of the defining concepts of Chaucer's and post-Chaucerian lament. It's the sense of abandonment by a lover, by a friend, by a ruler, by a set of joys, by rewards that inspires everything from the Book of the Duchess, where it appears prominently, through the poetry of Lydgate, Hawes, Skelton, George Ashby, and so on. It's everywhere in the poetry of Charles d'Orléans, a remarkably underrated poet, not just in French, but also in English, who was a very careful reader of the post-Chaucerian tradition, and it collocates with words such as complain, comfort, dull, and heaviness. It's the fulcrum, I think, on which these Chaucerian and Boethian concerns balance. But for poets of the 15th and the early 16th century, the greatest absence was Chaucer himself. So much verse from Lydgate through Hawes and beyond begins with the lament that Chaucer is dead, Hardly anybody writing between 1400 and the mid-1500s in English, hardly anybody could not begin a text without avowing the simple fact that Chaucer was missing. The Flower of Courtesy by Lydgate affirms Chaucer is dead. A century later, Stephen Hawes, in The Comfort of Lovers, ventriloquizes the clerk's lament for Petrarch. Petrarch is dead, and nail it in his chest, by saying Chaucer and Gower and Lydgate, quote, are dead, their bodies nailed in chest. 15th century verse making is profoundly elegiac for these reasons. The language of Boethian loss, the phraseology of Romance departure, the condition of political exile or imprisonment, the sense of having been abandoned, and the fact that Chaucer, father of English poetry, is dead. And so with this awareness, I think we can see, as I'm trying to suggest, the way in which this poet, by Wyatt, responds to, reworks, and in many ways transforms many of these older traditions and idioms into an argument for Tudor courtly culture, or the Tudor courtly experience. I want to say a little bit about dullness. Many people think that 15th century writing is dull, and much of it is. Many people think that dullness is a condition of post-Chaucerian life, and it is. Many people think that the dullness of the poet contrasts with the aureate glitter of the language of the Chaucerian tradition, and it does. But I think dullness is also a Boethian condition. And some of you may remember the opening of the Consolation of Philosophy, the first two lines of the poem, Carmine qui quandam studio Florenti peregi, flebilis hoi maestos cogor inire, flebilis hoi maestos cogor inire modos. Once I wrote verses florente, flowering, flourishing with knowledge studio. Now I begin by writing sad meters, maestos modos. In John Walton's English translation of the Consolation, datable to about 1410, he says, out, alas, how dull and deaf his is. That is, there is this sense that what Walton is doing is he is from the start taking this language of dullness and he is translating it into the condition of the Boethian prisoner. And there is a wonderful, out, harrow, I mean, really? The Boethian prisoner as a kind of character out of a Chaucerian fablio? Out, alas, who dull is this? It's a wonderful synthesis of Chaucerian vocabulary with the Boethian idiom. Me spirits be all taken. That's the way Walton puts it. Uncomforted, he says. And Walton's Boethius goes on, this wretched leaf that is uncomfortable will draw along and tarrieth new alas. So what I'm getting at is that in addition to thinking of dullness in the 15th century, in David Lawton's phrase, as a political issue, as an aesthetic issue, and as an issue of literary history, I want you to think of it as well as this philosophical problem drawn explicitly from the Boethian tradition. I want to contrast absence absenting with probably the poem that most people know as the one Wyatt poem that they know. The Norton Anthology poem, the undergraduate poem, your graduate reading list poem, your I have to teach Wyatt today, what am I going to do poem. And that is, They Flee From Me, which I am giving you here in its manuscript version from Devonshire. They flee from me, that sometime did me seek with naked foot, stalking in my chamber. I have seen them both gentle, tame, and meek, that are now wild, and do not remember that sometime they put themselves in danger to take bread at my hand, and now they range busily seeking continual change. Thanked be fortune it had been otherwise, 20 times better. But once, in especial, In thine array after a pleasant guise, in thin array after a pleasant guise, when her loose gown from her shoulders did fall, and she me caught in her arms long and small, but therewithal sweetly she did me kiss, and softly said, Dear heart, how like you this? It was no dream, for I lay broad waking, but all is turned through my gentleness into a strange fashion of forsaking, and I have leave to part of her goodness, and she likewise to use newfangleness. But since that I so gently am served, what think you by this that she hath deserved? Now this too, like Absence Absenting, is a poem of distance and distress. It locates the speaker in this uneasy space between companionship and loneliness. They Flee From Me appears a dozen folios away from Absence Absenting in the Devonshire manuscript, and they are in the same scribe's hand. Reading it in this version, I want to suggest, its old idioms stand out. And I've read both of these poems in a modern English pronunciation and paraphrase, and I think it would be possible to read both of these poems in a historical pronunciation so that you can see, in effect, how late Middle English they really are. But look, for example, at the line in They Flee From Me, busily seeking continual change. With Chaucer on your mind, this will harken back to Chaucer's own frequently voiced concerns in his short poetry about the relationship between busyness and change. The word newfangleness returns us again to Chaucer's Boethian rejection of things new. There is much of lack of steadfastness. There's much of gentleness here. There's much even in the phrase, her arms long and small. She caught me in her armas, long and smaller. That's right out of the Merchant's Tale. He caught her with her armas, long and smaller. The Chaucerian short poem, however, that stands behind all of this is his poem Truth. This is, if manuscript count is to be believed, the most popular of Chaucer's short poems. I think there are 23 or 24 manuscripts, only one of which has that envoy to Vache at the end of it. It's copied continuously throughout the 15th century. It shows up unattributed to Chaucer in Toddle's Miscellany of 1557 with the title, To Lead a Virtuous Life, and then there is not a period but a comma after the title, and then you get Chaucer, Flee From the Press, and you get that Chaucerian move. So the poem famously begins, Flee from the press and dwell with Sothfast Nessa. This is the argument from Boethius. Be happy with what you have, control your temptations, take what you receive gracefully, do not wrestle for worldly goods, you're a pilgrim, a beast who can attain true human spiritual virtue by recognizing that your true home is in the heavens. All of these paraphrases in the poem look back to the dialogue between Boethius and Lady Philosophy. In Wyatt's hands, this injunction becomes a guide to the art of courtiership. Flee from the press. Flee from the press appears several times in Wyatt's poetry, most famously in the satire to his friend John Poyntz. The words flee, fleeing, fly, and fled are characteristic of Wyatt's verse. In a longer version of this, I would give you the 23 individual citations and quotations, but I want to stress that this word flee is central to the way in which Wyatt takes the Chaucerian injunction to certain kind of moral behavior and turns it into a highly site-specific political and social injunction to deal with the court. Absence is a condition. Fleeing is an action. What Chaucer did in Truth was to provide later courtly readers with a new trope of departure. The 15th century condition of absence is precisely that. It is a condition. It is the state of loss left by the loss of a lover, or a friend, or a patron, or a poetic model. It's a state of being. And I think one of the reasons why so much Chaucerian 15th century poetry seems so static and immobile to us as modern readers is precisely because it is concerned with a meditation on a state of being. Fleeing is a verb of action. It is the result of will or agency. It signals or enjoins a change in condition. Its power in the poems, written in the wake of Chaucer's truth, lies in the ways in which it crystallizes the ability to make decisions and do things. Absence is the static lament of the dulled. Fleeing is the active response of the alert. The very condition of the Boethian prisoner is a move from lamenting absence to fleeing a particular condition. Absence and fleeing might be thought of as the two poles, then, of late medieval and early modern poetic voicing, and in turn the two poles of Chaucerian reception. So the relationship between the two poems that I'm giving you here, Absence, Absenting, and They Flee From Me, is not, I want to suggest, the relationship of a poet on a bad day and a good day. One of them is not, this is good Wyatt, this is bad Wyatt. This is not a question, it seems to me, of a poet that we want and a poet that we don't want. What I see in both of these poems, and in the range of so much early modern lyric, is a development, if you like, of ventriloquisms, of voices and of masks. Absence, Absenting might be seen then as the poet putting on the mask of, or ventriloquizing the voice of, a late 15th century aureate Chaucerian poet. They Flee From Me might be seen as the poet putting on the mask or taking up the voice of a 14th century Petrarchan lyricist. Such an approach, I think, helps to continue to move us away from that older teleology of medieval to Renaissance, and how these different voices can coexist on a manuscript's page. In the courtly audience and in the printed book, it's clear that there is a creative engagement with these older traditions that is not about nostalgia, that is not about old-fashionedness, but that is about recognizing how the voice of the Boethian, post-Chaucerian, dulled figure lamenting an absence, how that voice can be reused for specific literary, social, at times satiric, and at times even amorous effects. So what I'm trying to suggest today, in the short amount of time that I have, is a program for looking anew at a body of lyric poetry, some of which we have neglected, and some of which we have privileged. A way of trying to understand the fluidity of literary periods, and a way, I think, pedagogically, of calling attention to the strangeness of those texts that have become overly familiar to us. I'm working from something called the online social edition of the Devonshire manuscript, which offers a facsimile and something of a diplomatic edition of it, and that as an available teaching tool at any level enables us to work with something approaching a material document, so that we understand that the manipulations of this poetry, from Tottle's Miscellany to the Norton Anthology, are not just editorial but profoundly interpretive, literary, historical moves. By bringing the Chaucerian back into Wyatt's world, I think we can also make a larger claim about the sustaining of literary historical motifs and the importance not simply of Chaucerian reception, but the recognition that there is no hard and fast break between what we think of as the medieval and what we think of as the early modern. And if I had more time, and if this were a different kind of group, I might call attention to the linguistic issues as well. You know, it's not as if one day William Caxton pulled the lever on his printing press and people stopped speaking and reading and writing Middle English. It's not as if these scribes who were trained in these courtly, institutional hands, it's not as if all of a sudden they decided they were doing Italian at secretary. There's a very clear paleographical, as well as linguistic, as well as generic and literary historical sense of tension and continuity that's embedded in these kinds of texts. And so the kinds of things that I see myself working on and teaching in the next few years will be to call attention to how we can vitalize this, if you like, interstitial period in literary history, in our survey courses, and in our close graduate teaching, and the way in which we can still return to the archive, even in a manuscript as familiar as the Devonshire manuscript and its poetry, that we can return to the archive and find new things. I end with a memory of another little poem that's in the Devonshire manuscript. It's a stanza that is cut out of a Chaucerian, of a Chaucerian apocryphal text, but gives voice to an idiom that was central to Western literary culture for millennia. And the poem begins, "If all the earth were parchment scribable, and all the seas were ink," and then it goes on to say, "no one could tell you how beautiful you really were," or "no one could tell you how wonderful you really were." But it occurs to me that one of the things we need to show our students is that all the earth is parchment scribable, and that the relationship of the literary text to the lived world does not begin and end with the edited page, but really must begin with the product of an individual hand at an individual moment. And it's with that hand and that moment that I find the genuine historicism of the lyric trying to give voice to a particular cultural moment in inherited as well as newly developed forms. So I think I've gone for a half an hour. I think I'll stop here and we'll have some questions. Thank you very much.
That's, by the way, the longest applause that we've heard in this room in a long time. I think it really is
Thank you.
indicative of how human is lucky. So much so that I'm going to ask the first question before passing the baton to people who really know what they're talking about. So I do have again, I'm not a specialist in anything, but I have a question though.
I'm not a specialist in anything.
Right.
That's right.
Exactly.
No, I understand. I understand. You don't know anything about Russia either.
No, exactly.
Right.
Exactly.
Yes.
So I just wanted to ask a question though that suggests really what this methodology can really do on more speculative terrain. So the idea that form is a medium for historicity,
Yes.
is a wonderful approach, obviously. And I'm just trying to think about ways in which, again, that can open up to more speculative concerns. I'm thinking about the ways in which, again, I said this would happen, right?
Yeah.
The ways in which this kind of dualism of absence and fleeing,
Yes.
As well as the kind of formal the doubling and duplicity figured in the absence poem, become the kind of repository or resounding medium also for the kind of Neoplatonisms that are coming back.
Nice. Right.
You can do that work extrapolating from
absolutely
civics.
Yes. And what I like about there are many things I like about what you said. I like the way you called attention in the absence of scenting poem to the way in which repetition really is thematically and dramatically meaningful. That is, the sense of doubleness is only reinforced by having repetition, because we know that repetition is a fiction. Anytime you say something the second time, it's different. And so you're exactly right that the trick of a poem like that is to use something that looks like simple iteration as the expression of ambiguity, doubleness, the multiple meaning. I think that's exactly right. I think this whole question of sort of the emergent Neoplatonism, but also the larger issue of how can I put it? How so much of the humanist anxiety about textuality, or the humanist concern with textuality, is still very much engaging with these kinds of traditions. And in particular, one of the things, I'll just segue into some of the things I've been thinking about for tonight. Sandy asked me to do a presentation on relationships between utopia and Shakespeare, and of course some of them are obvious, but one of the things that I found that I think is less obvious that people have started working on is the way in which embedded in utopia, as embedded, is more than embedded in Shakespeare, is an argument about what is the place of the aesthetic and political control? What is the place of music? What is the place of literature? And what is the place of affective response in the making of the state? And this is traditionally thought of as a quote-unquote humanist problem, right? But it's very much a Chaucerian, Boethian problem, and it's very much a problem that older Platonist, that Chartrian Platonist move looked to by arguing that poetry was the ideal vehicle for philosophy, and by using commentaries on the constellation of philosophy to work out this sense of a kind of poeticized cosmos. So my question would be, and this is just a rhetorical thing, but that when the sort of Ficinian Platonism and the humanist Platonism rediscovers all this, is part of what they're engaging with, this older Platonic interest, this older Platonic revival interest, in the way in which discourse, discovery, and political rule are potentially aestheticizable problems. That makes sense? Yeah. And I think those are some very, very big questions that I can't answer here, but that's some of the provocation for returning to this material in this way. Thank you. Yes?
Hi. So first I just wanted to say thank you for your talk, and I really love this idea of estranging literature, and that's one of the great things about teaching these poems is you get to, it's like getting to come to the poem again with fresh eyes for students. So I wanted to talk a little bit, especially since you were just emphasizing what affect does as politically. And you talked a lot about dullness.
Yes.
And so one of the things, I'm teaching a class right now on Renaissance literature in French. I'm on the French side of things, so I don't know a whole lot about the English tradition. But one of the things that we've been discussing is the way in which Neoplatonism and humanist ideas are translated into lyric poetry differently by women and men.
Absolutely.
So I'm wondering if there is a gendered aspect. You said that dullness was sort of a philosophical, political process.
Yes.
Is it also a gendered political?
I think that's a wonderful point, and I think it's very clear that part of the male poetic identity that emerges is very much this. And one of the things that's very interesting to look at in this manuscript tradition is the way in which women in particular groups have a certain scribal agency. We can identify women's hands, we identify certain manuscripts with women, we identify certain late medieval compilations with country houses or with estates where we can historically recover the interests and concerns of women. So I think it's very, very clear that this dullness thing is very, very much a gendered issue. So then the question becomes, what are those things in female texts, in late medieval and early modern English lyric poetry, that seem to circle around the whole question of voice and agency? And one of the things that seems clear from looking at a collection like the so-called Findern manuscript, the late 15th century collection that's centered, I think, around Derby, and it has been attributed to a set of women readers and writers, or to several of the texts in the Devonshire manuscript that are associated with particular women in the Howard household, and so on and so on, is that, how can I put it, is that the fundamental myth is, of course, the story of Procne and Philomela and Tereus. And again, the Chaucerian inheritance of the way that Chaucer retells that tale in The Legend of Good Women, the way it stands behind issues in Troilus and Crusade, the way in which Gower will retell it, the way in which this becomes a narrative of the stanched female voice. And the way it becomes a narrative not just of violence against women, but it becomes a narrative of the way in which the silenced woman uses representational graphic inscription, writing, tapestry making, whatever, to articulate that self. And I think that as you trace through this, one of the fascinating, I don't want to say tensions, but let's say dialogues, between the male search for voice as an expression of dullness, an absence, a sense of fleeing, a language that's designed to generate agency in these highly conceptualized terms, is to look in the manuscripts and in the early printed books and in the literary history with the way in which that story of Procne and Philomela is constantly in the background and constantly going back and forth. And so this question of what is gendered about what I'm talking about is very, very real. Does this speak to some of the things you were thinking about?
Absolutely, and it's interesting because we've just finished our sort of poetry section. Now we're moving on to I've done that home, which is very much a Chaucerian project as well. And this is exactly sort of, it's this retelling of this story, of this narrative of violence against women,
yes,
by a woman rewriting it, sometimes through the voice of a man, sometimes through the voice of a woman. But it's interesting to see how these questions of violence against women and fleeing is a very interesting notion, because the idea is that the woman should be fleeing from the man, so that to take it and to say that this is in fact this masculine notion of fleeing is very interesting.
And if you want, you could argue that post-Virgilian literary history is the history of men fleeing. I was teaching the Aeneid to my freshman undergraduates in humanities. And of course, now you can never teach the Aeneid to a group of 19-year-olds with Aeneas as the hero. You just can't. And all they wanted to say is he's running away. The whole diasporic notion of post-Trojan Imperium is this guy running away and leaving these women behind him. And so embedded in the fleeing question, I think a more subtle version of what I'm saying is this. Any injunction for the man to flee implies that someone or something will be left behind. And invariably that something or someone will be a woman or a surrogate for a woman. And I think that also genders this question in a very powerful way. Thank you. Other thoughts or responses? Yes?
I was interested not just in the period of bleed that you were describing between the medieval and the Renaissance, but also what I take to be a kind of methodological bleed between the sources and the formalism. And it reminded me of Roland Barthes, who said, a little bit of formalism takes us away from history, but a lot brings us back to it.
Sure.
And this sort of the moment at which these things start to unravel each other was something that I'm sort of interested in
yes.
the talk. And I see the implicit necessity to historicize that which people aren't historicizing, the lyric.
Yes.
But I'm wondering to what end, because one of the great things about not historicizing the lyric has been precisely that we're able to compare lyrics from China and
exactly.
Yes,
that's right.
Right. And so that's been a great innovation and the spawn of a lot of creativity in literature. But I'm wondering, how do you see your sort of methodological contribution in this kind of bleed? Where do you see the importance of that? Right.
I think a lot of you've asked a really powerful question, because it's really a question about how historicist or ahistoricist certain disciplines really are. And one version of comp lit was the, take X and Y and bring them together with the idea that genre or form was somehow universal or somehow transhistorical or somehow transcultural. And so the question becomes, not every short poem is a lyric. Right? Not every short poem in the first person is a quote-unquote lyric at any given time. I think that there are several ways of responding. One is to say, if we look at if we ask the question, what is the social function of short poetry in the first person, in particular literary cultures at particular literary times? And then by comparing those, part of what we're doing is a broader cultural and social project than simply the idea that we have two examples of the same thing that just happen to be in different languages or in different times. The other is, what is it about, and this is sort of the meta version of the answer, what is it about the process that I have described that generates a scholarly and critical affective response in us? In other words, not just about individual readers or audiences. Let's historicize the audience for Wyatt. Let's historicize the audience for certain poems or certain performances. But the recognition that there is an emotive content to our scholarly activity. And that emotive content has not been excavated. One of the things that I find fascinating about Culler's new book, I don't know if you've seen it or if any have seen it, Theory of the Lyric, is that, he goes through and he takes 9 representative lyrics from Sappho through Wordsworth and Hölderlin and, a bunch of others. And he comes right out and he says at the beginning, he says, there's a lot of great work done in interpreting lyric poetry. I'm not going to do that. I'm going to talk about the poems, he says, that I have taught and loved. And that's Culler talking, right? And that is to me a dazzling move, because it's not simply the naive move of the principle of organizations in the book is the crap I like. The argument is that there is an affective response that we get in making the comparative move. I think, the work that I did on Erich Auerbach is in retrospect about that. That is, it's about how the process of writing this history of realism generates and expresses a particular emotional response, a recordable affect in the scholar, and that's part of what we transmit to our students. So what I'm getting at is not to necessarily dismantle the idea that we can do this and we can do that. When my first job many years ago was at Princeton, and one of my colleagues was Earl Miner. And I remember the first year that I was there in 1980, the graduate students put on a parody show making fun of all the faculty. Unfortunately, I had just arrived, so they couldn't do anything with me. But they had a student get up and dressed as Earl Miner to deliver a lecture on the stunning absence of Japanese-linked poetry in Paradise Lost. Okay, which, so the idea, the comic version of this is to say that, part of Miner's genuine genius was to figure out some way of talking cross-comparatively about things, but in ways that were not just under-theorized, but very unself-conscious. And what I'm getting at is that it is the self-consciousness of the motives for doing this that may produce the meaningful critical narrative rather than the narrative about the transhistorical or transcultural nature of a particular genre. Does that make sense? And that's what I see as one of the ways in which we can infuse this broader comparative project with a very powerful pedagogical content. Rather than just simply saying, this is the history of genre, this is the narrative of reading. This is the narrative of scholarly comparison in that way. Other thoughts? Yes, Scott.
Yeah, you mentioned with the Cambridge history of medieval literature, the lyric is largely absent from that book. Can you go back to some of the earlier Middle English lyrics, like you mentioned the Harley manuscript, and how we might begin to put some of these principles that you talk about with the later lyrics
Right.
in action with the medieval, the earlier medieval text?
Sure, that's a great question, and the way I would answer it is the following, that when we look at the history of the lyric in the post-conquest world, we're looking at two media. One of them is the anthology, and the recognition that virtually every poem that comes down to us is always already anthologized. That is, they're already contextualized, and they already exist as a kind of second-order thing. You know, there are no originals in that way. And so we need to ask ourselves, what are the contexts? Something like the Harley lyrics, as many of us know, are these 30-odd collections of Middle English poems preserved in a manuscript, but they are interlarded among French prose, Latin poetry, Middle English, a whole, romance, a whole body of things whose social and historical meaning may be about some aspect of literary culture at a particular time. It may be about the way in which a scribe trained in the Latin traditions of official writing is turning to or commissioned to the transcription of vernacular literature. A whole range of things. But part of what they're not about is this thing, the Harley lyrics. The other version is the many, many poems that survive as marginalia and as individual leaves. And one of the things that I think is very interesting about that, as well as in Harley, is the way in which very, very few Middle English poems until the middle of the 14th century are written out as lineated poetry. That the default, as we know, the default for Anglo-Saxon and Germanic poetry is to write it out as if it were continuous prose. The Owl and the Nightingale, Middle English poem, probably datable to the last decades of the 12th century, is preserved in two manuscripts from about the 1230s or so. In both of those manuscripts, The Owl and the Nightingale is written out as rhymed poetry. The Owl and the Nightingale is probably the first sustained piece of writing in post-conquest English that's written out as poetry. In one of the manuscripts, The Owl and the Nightingale shares space with Lageman's Brut. Lageman's Brut in that manuscript is written out as continuous prose. In the Harley manuscript, some of the poems are written out as short lines. Some of them are written as long lines. Some of them are written as block paragraphs. There is meaning to this which I think is not wholly contingent or accidental. That is, what is the organization of these words on the page doing to convey a certain meaning about what this thing is and how it works? So, in answering your question, I'm looking at not just the idea that these texts exist in a manuscript version, different from or prior to an edition, and not even that they exist in collections, but this whole question of the way that they're organized on the page. So when you get the, Susanna Fine supposed diplomatic edition of the Harley manuscript, and you realize that she's taking all these poems that are written in all of these different forms and she's putting them in rhymed stanzas. Or she's taking poems where there will be a refrain and the refrain will be given once and then in subsequent things it'll be just be the first two words and etc. And she's printing them all out. That creates in the mind of the reader the illusion that this is a book of something other than it is. And so this, again, for me, is the relationship, getting back to your question, about form and history. That form is not just lyric, stanza, genre. It's this relationship between the visual organization of texts, of words on the page, and the expectations of the readers, the generation of the readers, to see how it works. The Carmina Burana manuscript has Latin poetry written out as if it were continuous prose. And I'm teaching a course at Cornell in the medieval lyric, and we started with the Carmina Burana stuff, and we're using the selection from P.G. Walsh. And Walsh begins by saying, there's this chunk of the Carmina Burana manuscript where all these love poems. Now, there's a bunch of stuff in the middle that has nothing to do with these love poems, and I'm leaving them out. Well, what is that stuff? Right? It's there. It's in the same hand. You see, it's the idea that we make these decisions, that there are some things that are literary and some things that are not. That to me is the ultimate issue. That we've made a set of decisions about the Harley manuscript or the Carmina or anything, that there's stuff in there that's literature. And there's stuff in there that's not. Or that, it's not a question of good and bad literature. It's that there's stuff that is subliterary or non-literary, and therefore doesn't merit inclusion in our quote-unquote literary histories. And that's part of the discourse. And, in Anglo-Saxon, that's one of the great problems. I remember back when I was working on Anglo-Saxon in some intensity, the Greenfield-Robinson bibliography that came out in 1980. The bibliography of Old English literature, right? So they begin by saying, what is Old English literature? Well, we think there's no better definition than that given by, and then they quote some 19th century German philologist, Völker maybe, in German, untranslated, which just says that Old English, the literary quality of Old English is selbstständig. It's just self-apparent. Right? And it's this wonderful moment when you go, well, what is it? And all I'm trying to say is that this what is it is so embedded and so deeply a part of our presuppositions that it prevents us from, I'm not arguing that Absence Absenting is a great poem, but I am arguing that if we're going to study this world, we have to recognize that this body of poetry, this body of literature, coexists in these ways, and that it is a historical and even potentially an aesthetic disservice to make these selections. You see what I'm getting at? I do, yeah. Thank you.